chapter 5 begins with a recap. In verse 1, we read, "This is the book of the genealogy of Adam." Let's stop right there and refer back to verse 4 of chapter 2, where we read, "This is the history of the heavens and the earth when they were created." That word history there is the same word translated genealogy here. I'm curious why the translators use a different word. As we saw when studying chapter 2, the Hebrew word is tuleda and refers to a genealogical record of successive generations. It's used 11 times in Genesis to mark the beginning of a new section. Now, some scholars believe that Moses used earlier records and oral traditions that had been passed on to him, compiling them into these early chapters of Genesis. The word book speaks of a scroll, specifically a written account of past events, and may be evidence that Moses drew his account from verse 4 of chapter 2 to this point from an ancient written account. For decades, it was the assumption of the academic community that writing was a very late development in history. But evidence keeps surfacing that pushes back the date of writing to an earlier and earlier time. It's best to take what Moses says here at face value. So again, verse 1, "This is the book of the genealogy of Adam. In the day that God created man, he made him in the likeness of God." In light of how often the creation of humans is referred to as being in God's image, it suggests that this is a truth that we ought to make front and center of our thinking. Christians especially ought to do that today when identity has moved to the forefront of cultural discourse and identity politics is playing such a big role in setting public policy. Human beings are not whatever they think themselves to be. They are what they were created to be, image bearers of God. Their identity is inexorably tied to who and what God says they are. Their flourishing is directly tied to their acceptance of what in fact they are. The essence of the fall was the satanically inspired human attempt to locate identity in something other than what God said. Note here that it says that humans are created in God's likeness. Back in chapter 1, it's stated this way. Verse 26, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image according to our likeness.'" Humans don't just bear God's image in a general sense, they possess it in a specific way. Being in God's image means humans are rational, emotional, and spiritual. But being in his likeness means that our rationality, our emotions, and our spirit are akin to God's. His capacity in all of those things is infinitely greater than ours, but what we possess is like his. That's why we can relate to him and he to us. So it's of intense interest that we read in verse 2, "He created them male and female, and blessed them, and called them mankind in the day that they were created." The first thing that Moses drills down on in stating humanity's likeness to God is the differentiation of male and female, something given divine sanction and blessing there. As we saw in an earlier study, God has no gender. Yes, he's referred to as Father, but that speaks of the nature of our relationship to him, not his gender. Humanity images, that is, it represents God to creation in its differentiation into male and female. In light of all of the so-called gender transitioning taking place today, it's important that we make clear that contrary to what many say, gender is not some purely human construct subject to fluid definition. Humans are, by design and creation, either male or female, raising the exception of the extremely rare condition where some are hermaphrodites. To disprove that is a distraction, the proverbial exception that proves the rule. Using hermaphrodites as justification for blurring gender distinctions for those who are biologically male or female would be like someone who's born with 4 normally functioning limbs claiming they have no arms or legs. Listen, I know it's not politically correct to say that, but that doesn't change the truth of the matter. And contrary to the accommodators who tell us that love requires us to affirm the lifestyle choices of those who've transitioned their gender from what their biology says to what they feel like they are, no. Love always and only stands on the side of what is true. And what is true is what we find here. I read it again, verse 2. God created them male and female, and blessed them, and called them mankind, humanity, in the day that they were created. Love is not capitulation to the delusions of a world in rebellion against God. Love clings to that which makes for God's glory and human flourishing. That only comes by loyalty to what God has said, even when it's unpopular. May I say, especially when it is. And now we read a record that's caused no little consternation among Bible students. Verse 3. And Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness after his image, and named him Seth. After he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. And so all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Now, as we read on in the next generations, we see that prior to the flood, people lived to be 800 to 900 years old. At least those named here did. It's reasonable to assume these aren't the only people who lived to such ages, but that everyone living at that time did. And why? How? Well, Moses doesn't tell us, but we have a clue in something we've already looked at and have yet to see. Back in chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, we read about God carving out the firmament, an expanse between the waters above and waters below. The firmament was the atmosphere surrounding earth, and above it was a thick vapor canopy that later we will read collapses, causing a torrential rain lasting 40 days and bringing about the flood. Before it collapsed, it's likely that canopy of water protected the planet from the cosmic radiation that destroys the telomeres on our genes and that keeps them from aging. In simple terms, the aging process was slowed down. The increased atmospheric pressure reduced the proliferation of germs and pathogens, which contribute to disease. But when the vapor canopy collapsed in the flood, that protection ended, dramatically increasing aging and illness. Now, we recently had some interesting weather here in Southern California where I live. What was called an atmospheric river dropped a lot of rain on us over a couple of weeks. It was much worse to the north of us in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, my wife and I just got back from a visit to the states to our east, Arizona, Nevada, Utah. They all got a lot of rain from the same weather system. It was amazing to realize the amount of water that can be suspended in those clouds. The vapor canopy was far denser than the clouds that you and I are familiar with. What's remarkable is that if you make a chart of the ages given here in chapter 5, you realize that Adam lived all the way to Noah's father's time, and Adam's son, Seth, died only 14 years before Noah was born. In verse 6, Seth lived 105 years and begot Enosh. After he begot Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. Enosh lived 90 years and begot Canaan. After he begot Canaan, Enosh lived 815 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. Canaan lived 70 years and got Mahalalel. After he begot Mahalalel, Canaan lived 840 years and had sons and daughters. And so all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. Mahalalel, well, he lived 65 years and begot Jared. And after he begot Jared, Mahalalel lived 830 years and had sons and daughters. And so all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. Jared lived 162 years and begot Enoch. After he begot Enoch, Jared lived 800 years, had sons and daughters. So all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. Now that same formula is repeated 5 times. Someone's born, has kids, dies. Then we have a change. In verse 21, Enoch lived 65 years and begot Methuselah. After he begot Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. And so all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So Enoch's story is different from those who came before him. He didn't die. There's this story that's told, kind of cute. On their way home from church, a mother asked her son, "Hey, what did you learn in Sunday school today?" And he said, "Well, we learned about Enoch." Well, his mom said, "Well, tell me about him. What did you learn?" The little guy replied, "Well, Enoch and God, they were friends. They spent a lot of time together. They liked to walk and talk and walk. And one day as they walked and they talked, it went so long that God said, hey, look, Enoch, we've come so far, we're closer to my house than yours. Why don't you just come home with me today? And so he did. That story seems to capture the essence of Enoch's story. The 11th chapter of the letter to the Hebrews sets Enoch before us as an example of what it means to have faith. In verse 5 there we read this, by faith Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death, and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. The writer of Hebrews then draws this conclusion from Enoch's example in verse 6. But without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Enoch shows us the life that pleases God. It's a life of faith that expresses itself in simply walking with God. The world defines success as attaining fame, power, wealth. Even many Christians think that being successful in faith means achieving some great accomplishment for God. But Enoch is our example of success. He pleased God by walking with him. There's no mention here that he did some great work. We read nothing of his building or his offering. He simply walked with God. Now, that doesn't mean that Enoch didn't do anything significant. He may have. In fact, he probably did. But whatever he may have accomplished, it all flowed from his abiding fellowship with God. The biblical record says that what stands out about Enoch was his walk with God. It was so close to the Lord, so intimate, and had such an amazing life-transforming impact on him that he got to the point where there was literally nothing left for his life on earth to teach him. Not even death could teach him. And so God translated him to heaven. And don't think that was easy for Enoch. Those weren't the good old days when being a believer and walking with God was easy. They didn't have Hollywood, drugs, liquor stores, pornography, and the internet deluging them with a daily barrage of temptation. But Enoch's time wasn't one in which people had nothing to do but go to church. On the contrary, it was a wicked time of massive corruption. So bad was it that in the days of Enoch's great-grandson, Noah, the only solution was the flood. You know, there's a link between our time and that in the words of Jesus. He said that the end times would be similar to Noah's. So no, it wasn't easy for Enoch to walk with God. Evil surrounded him, as it does us. And yet he kept his focus and maintained his walk. If Enoch could do it, we can even more do so because we have something he didn't. We have the abiding presence of God's Spirit indwelling us. When it says that Enoch walked with God so closely that God translated him into glory without him dying, we wonder, what did that look like? This is one of those places in Genesis we wish that we had more detail. How grand it would be to have Enoch's calendar, his daily routine spelled out for us. What did his walking with God look like? What was the secret of his success? Why didn't he write a book so that we could take a class in how to walk with God? You know, actually, we have that book. It's the Bible. Specifically, we have the Gospels that tell us of the life of Christ. For he models for us, even better than Enoch, how to walk with God. Walking with God means taking him at his word and trusting him each moment. It means abiding in the conscious presence of God, holding on to the awareness that we live before him. He not only sees and hears all, he wants to be a vital, active part of all that we're doing, our forever companion, friend, guide, help, and counselor. And all of that is possible because Jesus died to remove the barrier of sin and then rose again to indwell us by his Spirit. We can walk with God as Enoch did. In the midst of a corrupt and wicked age, we can walk with God. Before Enoch's assumption to heaven, he fathered Methuselah. And so in verse 25, Methuselah lived 187 years and begot Lamech. After he begot Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years and had sons and daughters. And so all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. Methuselah's name means, when he dies, it comes. Methuselah died the same year as the great flood that we'll read about in a moment. Jude 14 says that Enoch, Methuselah's father, was a prophet. It seems that God warned him the flood was coming, and so he named his son after what was his destiny. That Methuselah lived for 969 years, longer than anyone else who's mentioned here, that's no accident. It's a testimony to God's long-suffering mercy. But that Methuselah died at 969 and not 970 years reminds us that if people won't repent, mercy ends in judgment. For many years, people have read the Bible and assumed that the Old Testament tells one story while the New Testament tells another. And they get this from the seeming harshness of God in the Old Testament and the mercy of Jesus in the New. Turns out one of the earliest heresies the early church had to deal with was started by a guy by the name of Marcion, who said that there were two gods, the angry, vengeful God of the Jews and the loving, forgiving God of the Christians. But a careful reading of the Bible reveals there's only one God who is both just and merciful. He hates sin, but he loves people. In truth, his love of people requires that he hates sin because it harms the people that he loves. That's why it's sin. The God who gave the law in the Old Testament to reveal what holiness and justice look like is the same God in the New Testament who sent Jesus to pay for our sin and make forgiveness possible. The Bible is a chronicle of God's mercy and grace from start to finish. God didn't operate by the law with Israel and then switch to grace with the church. It's always been about grace. We see that here with Methuselah. God waited patiently for nearly 1,000 years for people to repent and turn to him. But as we see people doing today, instead of using the lack of judgment as a space in which to repent, they just became ever more corrupt and increasingly wicked until all that was left was judgment. Verse 28, Lamech lived 182 years, had a son, and he called his name Noah, saying, "This one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord has cursed." After he begot Noah, Lamech lived 595 years and had sons and daughters. And so all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. Lamech expresses the desire for the redemption that God had promised back in Genesis chapter 3 when Adam and Eve first sinned. He hoped that it would come through his son Noah. Noah wasn't the realization of that hope, but it was through him that the line went that would lead ultimately to Jesus. Verse 32, and Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. By the time that Noah was 500, these three sons had already been born. It's likely that Noah and his wife had more children than this, but only these are mentioned because they're the only ones who'll join him on the ark.